Thank you, everyone, and thank you for that just beautiful, beautiful welcome today and to this beautiful land. In Australia, for those of you that have attended conferences or sessions, you would know that we also do an acknowledgement of country in honour to pay our honour and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So today I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting here on traditional lands and to pay my respects to the elders of this land, both past and present, and also to the children of the future who are so important to us. And this is my acknowledgement, but also a thank you for being hosted on this country, and also a personal commitment to honour the First Peoples of my nation in Australia with the many challenges that they're facing, to remember the past injustices that have occurred and to acknowledge the fight in Australia for constitutional recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for reconciliation, and also for the educational future of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, which must be present in our thoughts and in our actions, considering that in terms of achievement gaps, these students can be up to 5 to 6 years behind students who come from a more advantaged background. And I guess I just want to start by talking about some of the things that are happening in Australia at the moment. And with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, if you've paid attention to some of the media stories that have come out of Australia over the past 12 months, one of the key things that I think is really appalling, actually, in terms of what's happening in Australia is that despite the injustices that have been committed in the past, despite the stolen generation, despite the national apology that was delivered by then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, despite the reconciliation movement and the fight for constitutional recognition, our leaders have not learned from our history and they've not dealt with some of the issues that are facing Aboriginal people today. Because who would have thought that in 2015, in Australia, we would be campaigning to stop the forced removals of Aboriginal people from their homelands and their communities? Shame. That governments would be forcing people out of their communities by withdrawing essential services such as healthcare, power, education. For that is what is being proposed in Australia. That Tony Abbott, the most recent past Prime Minister, I'm not quite sure what to call him, but anyway, I'll talk about him in a moment, would refer to the deep spiritual and cultural connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have with their country as a lifestyle choice that our government does not believe in funding, one that the government can't endlessly subsidise, and hence the withdrawal of funding to states and territories, the impact being a potential 150 communities at risk. Or that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds would be facing such significant achievement gaps. And that's why, as I go through this speech today, why Gonski, or the I Give a Gonski campaign for us is so important. It's so important. But one of the things that I thought I might also bring your attention to is the other issue of national shame that we have in Australia, and that's the issue of refugee and asylum seekers, and what the Australian government is doing in terms of their policies. And they're not alone, because they have been policies that have been supported by other political parties as well. In February this year, a report was released called The Forgotten Children, and it was a story of children who are in detention in Australia. And may I say that we are the only country to detain children in this way. I think the other country that comes close is the UK, where children can be kept in detention for 72 hours. Compare that with the statistics on this slide. We've got one child who's been in detention for over 5 years. We have appalling things happening to these children and their families, and the average length of time, as you'll see there, that children spend in onshore immigration detention is 345 days. This report details some of the atrocities that are happening to these children under our care. And that is serious issues of physical and emotional and sexual abuse. Children as young as 7 reporting incidences of abuse. Young mothers sewing their lips together in protest about the conditions that they and their families are living in. and the fact that their young babies are having difficulty learning how to walk because their entire family is contained in a room 1.5 metres by 1.5 metres, bunk beds down one side, mattresses that you pull out from the floor, and you go outside into 50-degree heat, and you're on decking with splinters and asphalt and dirt, that the children cannot actually learn how to crawl, and then hence, the skills of walking. And I think we have to talk about this. We have to raise awareness about what's happening. And I saw a report just this week that in terms of the UN had a special rapporteur that was going to go to Australia to actually talk to people about what's happening in our detention centres and also in the offshore centres on Manus Island and Nauru to refugees. And because of legislation that was passed in July this year, where teachers, healthcare workers, medical workers, doctors, can now face up to 2 years imprisonment if they speak out about this issue. 2 years. So you think about, your obligations as a teacher to be mandatory notifiers and to look after the children in your care and to report issues of abuse and harm, and you go public and you can actually now be jailed for that, for doing so. Because of that situation, the rapporteur cancelled their trip to Australia because of the concern that anyone who talked to them about the refugee situation would actually face 2 years in jail. It's a reality and it's happening in our country. That despite a commitment to take an extra 10,000 refugees from the Syrian crisis, the new Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has confirmed that not a single refugee from Manus Island or from Nauru will ever step foot on Australian soil. Not one. So what will happen to these people? What will happen to these people? So I guess these policies, and certainly our coalition government's policies on climate change, on marriage equality and education and more, were in fact so unpopular that the past Prime Minister Tony Abbott had 30 bad opinion polls in the last in a row. So I guess hence his new nickname as One-Term Tony, as he was overthrown by his own party. But I thought I'd also just share with you, this is one of the pictures that was released as part of the report. When the Human Rights Commission did the report, they actually asked children who were in detention to draw pictures. And so I think this really tells a story. There were a lot of pictures, some of children who were crying tears of blood, and others of their families being locked up. But this one really speaks to me because they do need our help, and we have to speak out publicly about it, about what's happening, because if these children and their families ever do leave these detention centres and come out into our communities and our schools, they're going to need some significant help in terms of rebuilding their lives, but also dealing with the emotional and very serious health issues of being incarcerated. So that brings me to, I had some statistics there which I'll just leave there for a moment. As you can see, a number of assaults and self-harm that were reported for those children over a 15-month period. That brings me to Tony Abbott, and I'm glad to see that our humour has crossed the seas, because this is Tony and his budgie smugglers as he became known. So I guess for the first time in Liberal history, he was overthrown by his own party just a couple of weeks ago, and it puts us in the interesting situation in Australia of having had 5 Prime Ministers in 5 years. Previously, we had 4 in 40. So we've moved into a new space where Prime Ministers seem to be, they rise and fall in terms of the opinion polls and what's happening in the media. And I guess members of Parliament's insecurities about whether they're actually going to win the next election. But the catalyst for this leadership challenge, amongst a big series of events that have occurred over the year, was actually a meeting of Pacifica Islander nations in Papua New Guinea to talk about the very real threat of flooding that's facing many countries in our regions, such as in Kiribati. And picture this, just after the summit on a Friday, just before he was toppled, Tony Abbott was having a conversation with his Immigration Minister, Peter Dutton. And first of all, as part of this conversation, not realising that there was a boom microphone overhead and that the entire nation could see what they were saying, standing together. First of all, they insulted Aboriginal people by referring to Cape York time. Cape York is a region where we have a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so reinforcing, those horrid old stereotypes about Aboriginal people. And this was just a few days after the Prime Minister had actually spent a week on Cape York with the First Peoples of our nation. But then Peter Dutton laughs and he says, well, time means nothing when you're about to have water lapping at your doors, ha ha ha. But in complete disregard and disrespect for the leaders who had met as part of this summit to actually talk about the serious issues relating to climate change facing this region. And as I said, it was at that point that they realised they had a boom microphone there and the whole world had heard their conversation. So Tony was gone 3 days later, and one of Australia's richest men, Malcolm Turnbull, is now our new Prime Minister. And I love, this is actually a headline. This came from the Northern Territory News, and this newspaper can get away with anything. They just come up with the craziest headlines, but I thought, well, this actually says it all, really, in terms of Malcolm. Now, there has been a positive boost in the polls, so they had their first positive poll with 30 consecutive polls. But however, as the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, said, if he'd been the person to topple Tony Abbott, he would have got a boost as well. So, But despite Malcolm's personal views, I mean, he has spoken up about marriage equality and climate change and other issues. Despite those views, and indeed Australia becoming a republic, within probably about 24 hours of taking on the top job, he was there reiterating his commitment to his party's policies and putting his personal views aside. So I think, to use an analogy that people have been using in Australia, it's clear that we've got the same horse but a different jockey. So what does this mean for Australia? We've got a new Education Minister, a guy called Simon Birmingham. You may have heard of Christopher Pyne, who was our previous Education Minister. I'm sure when Angelo was here, he probably gave you lots of stories about Christopher. But in terms of Simon, we're yet to see whether he'll forge a new path or whether he'll stick to some of the current government positions. And I think we really have to understand the conservative forces that are at work in Australia, undermining the public education system. And note I said a system. We're not a series of small islands that are disconnected from each other. We're part of a system and we work best when we can collaborate and work together. But it's also a system that has to be funded by governments, and it's a system that, in terms of our Gonski campaign, we're fighting to maintain and improve. But yet there have been a steady stream of attacks on this system from people such as the most recent Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, who stated publicly that it's not a federal government responsibility to fund public education. He believes that should be put off to the states and that the federal government should fund private education only. And that's also been backed up by quite a negative political agenda from the coalition government, an attack on our professionalism as teachers, from teacher quality or read lack of, to Australian curriculum changes, and I'll talk about those in a moment, the mantra about poor performance, and also an organisation called Teach for Australia, where they put people in front of classrooms with just six weeks training. And the list goes on. I actually participated in the primary session just before lunch, and they were talking about curriculum and, the important, what does education actually look like and what it should look like. So I want to refer briefly to the Australian curriculum, which is a curriculum that has been agreed to by all of the states and territories in Australia. But I don't think anyone in our profession actually realised what was planned. And the day before Christopher took on a new job, his parting gift to education was to make significant changes to the national curriculum. And he did this in consultation with the education ministers that we have around the country. But in conversation with one of those ministers, they didn't actually realise what was being proposed either. So it's going to be really interesting to see whether the states actually follow through with this. But some of those changes included the scrapping of history and geography and civics and citizenship as standalone subjects, which have been described as, and I'll quote this one, green left anti-capitalist propaganda. I get it. Why would we want students to, understand our history and where we've come from and where we're going to, and also to be democratic participants and, stand up and critically engage in our society? The mandating of phonics was the next one as the solution to growing achievement gaps in literacy, and a greater emphasis on what's described as Australia's Christian heritage and the influence of Western civilisation. And that comes whilst removing significant aspects of Indigenous education, environmentally sustainable education as a cross-curriculum strand, and now that will be taught buried in history, geography and art, because apparently that's where they naturally fit. So not having those cross-cultural understandings embedded in our curriculum and the work that we do with our students. And I guess as a teacher, these changes absolutely horrify me, because I want to see a broad curriculum that provides the opportunity for the child to develop and to grow as a person, and a curriculum that values that development but also sets them up to be successful participants in society. And I think for our students it means not only having the fundamental skills but something more, that capacity to participate, that capacity to question, to understand their rights and their freedoms and their responsibilities, and to have a say in their futures, and also, most importantly for me, to have respect and tolerance and understandings of others and their diversity. And if we remove those fundamental aspects of our curriculum, then I think that's gravely at risk. And I think as teachers, there is a bit of hope here. I actually think that most teachers in Australia are going to say, get nodded. We're actually going to do what we know works and what is right for our kids, rather than implement a curriculum that's been mandated by politicians that really have got no understanding of what happens in our schools. That's my hope. The other serious... Thank you. The other serious issue that's just emerged in the last week is what has been called radicalisation kits in Australia. So it's a kit that's been sent to every school to assist teachers to identify the radical students that you have in your school that might be those students who leave Australia to become jihadists in the future. So what does a radical student look like? Well, let's look at the case study. So one of the case studies it's actually become, if you look #free Karen, you'll see this entire movement that's generated around this case study. Because Karen is a young woman, a young female student. She likes alternative music and she attends environmental protests. She's a radical. Now, I've just described my daughters. I've just described all of their friends, but apparently, I need to be on a radical alert, because that's one of the things that we should be looking out for. I think really the greater concern is that we are working in an environment where our government wants us to teach our children to fear and to question the kids that are sitting next to them in the classroom and their motivations, and that for me is a great tragedy. And it's really interesting that some of those fabulous skills that some of our kids have, and those passions that they have in terms of speaking up and fighting for the environment and causes that are passionate to them, would be identified by our government as a problem. Okay, moving on, because I've only got 4 minutes to finish, I think, but I've got a lot more to say. So I guess one of the things that I just wanted to bring to your attention is our Gonskier campaign. The Gonskier review was the most comprehensive review that we had in terms of schools funding in the last 40 years, and it determined that we needed a new funding model in Australia, a model that established a schooling resource standard, so a benchmark in terms of funding for our students, and indexation for schools that sit below that benchmark to bring them up over 6 years, and then indexation for schools that sit above that, so that at the point in time all of those schools should meet. But it also found that there is an additional cost for teaching children who come from a disadvantaged backgrounds, so there would be loadings implemented for those children. Now, we had a massive campaign and we were just so pleased to get to the point where this was a key election issue for the last federal election. But unfortunately, the Coalition came out and said they were on a unity ticket and that they would implement Gonski. 7 weeks after the election, Tony Abbott said, we're going to keep the promise that we actually made, not the promise that some people thought we made or the promise that some people might have liked us to have made with respect to schools funding. So what happened is that they committed to 4 years of the 6-year transition, and that means that there's a whole group of schools that will never get to the schooling resource standard for their kids. And this year's budget confirmed, this just gives you a little bit of a picture of why we need it in terms of recurrent funding for the sectors. It is a model that's sector blind, so it does cover the 3 sectors, but I think that sort of tells its own story. This year's budget, we actually got an indication of what the Coalition will do post-2017 after that 4th year of Gonski, and that is that they will fund only recurrent funding for schools based on CPI and also student enrolments. So for us, that's the public sector, it's a $2.7 billion cut, and we think that's equivalent to around 20,000 educators. So imagine the situation that we will have. We've got a number of states that are in full implementation of Gonski. The funds are in schools, they're delivering fantastic programs, they're achieving great results with students. In 2 years' time, the funding stops, and so does the employment of those people and the impact of those programs on students and their achievements. So no Gonski and no loadings, and virtually no Commonwealth education funding targeted at poor and disadvantaged students. One of the other key issues was students with disability. We have 5.3% of our students are receiving funded support at school for students who have a disability, yet we've just been through a very big data collection process which tells us that whilst 1 in 20 are being funded, in fact 1 in 6 actually need the funding. And one of the other commitments that was given was that the Gonski disability loading would be implemented. Should have had it this year, it's not there. Should have it next year. There is no indication in the budget that that money will be delivered, and nothing coming out of Parliament with respect to getting that money in place. So it's a critical part of our campaign to make sure that that money can actually go into our schools, because you know that in terms of public schools, we actually do the heavy lifting for children with disadvantage. And in Australia, we have over 80% of students with a disability are in our sector. And we have a higher percentage of those students who have the most severe disabilities, and those kids need the resources in place in their schools. So I just thought I'd share this slide with you as well, because in terms of what I was talking about previously around achievement gaps for advantaged and disadvantaged students, this tells the story. So this is data, it's based on NAPLAN data, and if you have a look at the indicators from 20 to 140, each line represents 1 year of achievement data there. So you can see in terms of our Indigenous students, we've got 5 to 6 year gaps, and in terms of our children who live in poverty, anywhere from 3 to 4 year gaps. That's why Gonski Schools funding is so important. We have to get the resources to those kids that need it most, and they're the kids in those schools. So what are we going to do about it? We've just begun the next phase of our campaign, the Gonski campaign, and you can go and have a look at I Give a Gonski if you want more information about it. But we want to make sure that this is a key election issue. We're not quite sure when we're going to head to a federal election. I guess it's going to depend on opinion polls and whether Mr Turnbull thinks he's got a bit of a honeymoon period happening. But we haven't left it to chance. We've engaged 18 local seat coordinators, and they're working across Australia in marginal electorates. They started work in July, and they will go until at least the next federal election and perhaps just a little bit beyond. And they're working with their local communities to raise awareness about Gonski, about the fact that it is getting results, and they're telling that very positive story about what's happening in schools and what's happening for some of their students. And I've heard these stories. I've been out on the road trip, having a meeting with schools and attending community forums about it. And honestly, it just brings tears to your eyes. You know, when you've got kids who are not participating in their education and they're now 18 months down the track of having resources and speech pathology or whatever they need, in place and they're participating. I mean, that's at the heart of it in terms of the work that we do. So our coordinators will be out working with our local communities, but we need to get bipartisan support for Gonski, and part of that is actually making sure that the Australian Labor Party meets their commitment with respect to Gonski, and they do have a strong policy commitment, but they've not put the funding commitment out there in the public domain. So it's a pressure campaign. We're pressuring both sides of politics to get them to a point where they actually commit to Gonski. And in an ideal world, I'd actually like to move this beyond the election cycle. I mean, education should be not, in terms of education policy, it should not be based on the whims of federal elections in terms of the resources that you get, you know. It's a fundamental right for our kids, and we should not have to continually campaign every 3 years to get funding in place for our schools. Schools should not be in the situation where they have to put on casual and temporary people because their funding is in a 2-year or a 3-year cycle and they don't know whether they've actually got permanent work for people. So that's my hope as part of this campaign, because for me there's no greater motivation really than achieving equity for our disadvantaged kids. So not only do we have to focus on the coalition government, but we do have to focus on the ALP as well. There's just some statistics for you in terms of the power of the story that we have. At the beginning of our campaign, we started with 0 supporters in terms of our website, and over the course of our campaign, we're now up to 147,000 supporters. And every time I talk about this, I have to check and I have to update that number because people are joining up. They get it. They get the needs-based funding is important, and they understand that kids who come from a disadvantaged background need to have resources in their schools so that their teachers and their support staff and their leaders can actually do the job that they need to do, which is provide an education for them so that they can be, active and full participants in society behind our schools once they leave school. So I guess, just in closing, we've got a tough challenge in Australia. We really have. The politics over the last couple of years have not been in our favour with respect to education. But it's a challenge that we're up for. We've got 187,000 members, and they are tapped into their schools and their communities, their TAFE institutes, their early childhood campuses, and they're able to tell that very personal story of what is happening in their community and get that connection with parents and school communities. And that's a critical aspect in terms of our campaign, because we want to make sure that education is at the forefront of what we do. So, as I say, it's a challenge, but I think we're up to it. Thank you.